Welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast, the only show that dares to be both on topic and on location. Each time we meet, we bring together a group of IT luminaries to discuss a single concept. In this episode, we're talking containers, or the lack thereof in the enterprise. But before we begin, let's quickly meet who's on the panel today. I'm your host, Stephen Foskett. You can find me on Twitter at @sfoskett, and you'll find my enterprise IT content at gestaltit.com.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Williams. I'm a multi-cloud consultant at Worldwide Technology. You can find me on Twitter at mistwire.com.
Hi, I'm Cormac Hogan. I'm a Director and Chief Technologist at VMware, focusing predominantly on storage. I'm on Twitter at Cormac J. Hogan, and I blog extensively on cormachogan.com.
Hi, I'm Drew Conry-Murray. I write and podcast at packetpushers.net. You can find me on Twitter at Drew_CM.
And I'm John Owings. I am a solution architect at Pure Storage focused on Kubernetes and how to connect storage to it. And you can find me on Twitter at John_2VCPs. And my blog is blog.2vcps.io. Pretty easy, hopefully.
Thanks, guys. So here's the premise. The orchestration is one of those things that is almost synonymous with containers nowadays. And the thought is that maybe the reason that enterprises haven't adopted containers so quickly is because they have lacked orchestration. They basically are hungry for a way to orchestrate containers in a way that fits in with their overall, environment. And I think that seems to be, in a way, the message of VMware. So Cormac, why don't you kick us off a little bit? Like, what's VMware's position on containers, and what's your thoughts on why enterprises have or haven't adopted containers?
From, I guess, a VMware perspective, or not even a VMware perspective, a lot of customers do think that Kubernetes is quite hard. In fact, if you look at Kelsey Hightower's blog, he does go through Kubernetes the hard way. And there's a whole bunch of things that you have to go through to step up a Kubernetes cluster. So things like just getting the tools ready, getting your certificates in place, things like setting up the etcd, setting up the control plane VMs, worker VMs. And there's this impression that there's a whole amount of work to be done just to get Kubernetes stood up. And that may have been the case a couple of years ago, but things are getting a lot easier. A lot of, I guess, people who are familiar with Kubernetes today would be using tools like kubeadm and so on, but they're not even doing all of the orchestration for you. They still leave things like load balancers and ingresses, and even the persistent storage that needs to be set up as well. So there is a project underway now to make that even easier. It's a project called Cluster API. And so this is basically using Kubernetes to stand up Kubernetes. And so as part of the Tanzu Kubernetes grid, we can talk about Tanzu later, but this is now essentially VMware's engineered version of Kubernetes. We're using Cluster API extensively to make it a lot easier to stand up your first Kubernetes cluster and just get started, make it a lot easier to get started. Does that answer your question?
So, do you find this, that's sort of the message that I got from, VMworld, for example, was that, VMware's goal was to make, containers easy for the enterprise. Is that going to work? Is that really what enterprises are hungry for? I don't know, Chris, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, it's definitely so the history of contain. I mean, I think we're all aware of the history of containers and Kubernetes and orchestration. What I've been seeing from my customer base, which is SMB all the way to Fortune 100, is it all depends upon the use case. When people started using containers, they started with very simple apps. Everything was baked into one layer. And then as things started, as people's maturation curve and utilization started to get better and go bigger, again, depending upon how many developers you had and how big your organization was, that need for orchestration kind of came as I'm not going to say came as an afterthought. They understood that they needed to get into it, but I don't think that they fully understood how difficult it was going to be. And that learning curve, I mean, we've all talked about how the Kubernetes learning curve is steep. And I think we're getting to the point now where we realize how steep it is.
I definitely think that orchestration is not the hurdle right now. There are probably 20 different tools that you could use to get Kubernetes, and some of them, VMware's the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, great tool, very easy to use. But there are others out there too that are super easy, and I think right now the gap is in skills, right? Is actually learning it, because there's a I don't know, select few that are really good at it, and getting the right information, because you could, if you run into an error and you Google it, you might find something from 2014 that should be not pertinent to what's going on at all. And so getting help for the latest error message from 2020 is hard.
I think another issue is, I definitely agree, Kubernetes, the skill sets aren't there. People are still ramping up on top of having to learn cloud and everything else. And when you get into Kubernetes, then you find out, well, maybe I also need a service mesh, so I've got to learn Istio Envoy, whatever else is coming along with that. We have to step back and ask a more essential question: are folks not getting it in containers because they're not sure whether microservices is the right approach for their applications?
And for many of the people I work with, just to build on that, is the microservices isn't a part that they're dealing with, right? They're infrastructure people. You know what I mean? They are building cloud, or they're building on-prem, VMware, vSphere, those types of things. And so the service mesh, or like tying the applications together, like they're getting told that's what's happening by someone else, by developers, by DevOps, somebody else. And they're trying to deliver this, and that's where they're kind of asking for help.
And I think that's a big part of it, John. I think there's a gap between what's happening at the Kubernetes layer and what's happening at the underlying infrastructure layer. And I think if we could bridge that gap by actually highlighting at the infrastructure layer what's happening at a Kubernetes cluster level, but maybe also vice versa, being able to bubble up what's happening at an infrastructure layer into Kubernetes, that would really help, I think, address that gap as well.
One thing that I find that's interesting is that I'm seeing basically, we talk about like DevOps, but I'm seeing the two camps of folks. We have the traditional, VMware administrators and the guys that have been, building data centers for decades. And then we have the developers, and the developers are pushing, the way that I see it is that they're pushing this need. They're pushing the scalability, the flexibility, all of the things that they need to get out of the environment. And from what I'm seeing, they're kind of dragging the administrators along. The administrators are having to learn about storage classes. They're having to learn about PVCs. They're having to learn about all of these things that the developers understand inherently, but then conversely, the developers don't understand the necessary the infrastructure needs, like your I/O and your throughput and stuff like that. And there's a communication gap in between the two, where we all talk about the DevOps unicorn. We're starting to see that people are starting to butt heads on that aspect.
One of the things that comes to mind during this whole conversation is, I guess we're kind of taking it for granted that enterprises haven't adopted, or are slow to adopt, or somehow not adopting containers. Is that even true? I mean, are enterprises not using containers, or is it just that IT infrastructure isn't aware of it, or that maybe we're just totally off base? What's the reality?
Again, it depends on your environment and your use case. If you're talking about like an insurance company, a very old insurance company. Actually, that's a really bad example, because they're on some of the most cutting edge stuff. Companies that are loath to move, they're kind of dipping their toes into it. But financials and insurance companies and people like that, they have bleeding edge departments that are fully baked into getting the Kubernetes and containers and dipping their toes into serverless and really getting into the bleeding edge of that. If you're starting a company brand new today, absolutely, you're getting into containers. You want the flexibility to be able to move into whatever cloud you want to get into. You don't want to get the vendor lock-in of a function as a service from one of the public clouds. So you flip over to Kubernetes and you get your containers up and running, and then you can port it wherever you want to go. So I see that people are absolutely getting into it. because most companies are turning into application and software warehouses now that happen to sell whatever product they're selling.
So Chris, I'm wondering if you're seeing that uptake happening more toward the cloud, the public cloud, or people using containers for deploying in a private cloud or on premises?
Well, it depends upon how old the company is. If it's an older company, then they're starting on premises, and they're starting and getting their feet wet, first on Docker desktop, and then, oh, that looks cool. Let's throw that into Tanzu, start getting it locally, and then they'll start working through multi-cloud migrations. Again, depends upon how baked in and how much infrastructure they already have.
And
I'll chime in a little bit on that too, is at least from what I've seen, kind of talking to customers across the country on, if they say containers, that's when I get called in, right? So there's kind of two paths. There's the ones that are doing it on-prem because their data has to stay within some defined walls for some reason, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the ones that are like, we can do whatever we want. And those are where we're having to decide, where's the data go? Do we put it on-prem? Do we put it in the cloud? Can we move it back and forth? It's a cooler conversation, right? Because it's got a lot of moving parts. It's a fun conversation for me, but it really depends. For at least from my perspective, it's not like the age of the company, like you were saying, Chris, but more where's your data have to be for whatever reason, right? Like some people have all kinds of reasons for it, but that is what it is.
And yeah, the point I was going to make as well with Chris's comments were the application as well. In a lot of cases, if it's an existing application, then you're going to have to refactor that completely. Things like a lot of these 12-factor apps, they have built-in replication that, they don't need the infrastructure to provide the availability. The availability is placed in the app. But that's not to say that there are customers who also want to bring traditional applications into Kubernetes as well. And I think that's where it becomes interesting from an infrastructure perspective, because are we now at the infrastructure layer responsible for doing some of those things that the typical cloud native applications do? So protecting it, replicating it, and so on and so forth. And
the lift there to piggyback on Cormac is that's almost on an application by application basis. It really gets down into the weeds of when, like, if you're dealing with a customer that's got 20,000 apps, and you have to figure out which one is more portable, which one is less portable, which one is still tied to a mainframe. I mean, there's so many implications that you have to weed through. It's fascinating and it's interesting, but refactoring to put into a container just for the sake of having a container is something you need to consider. I'm not saying it's a good idea or bad idea. It's something you need to consider.
A small counterpoint I'd like to throw out there, if I can, Stephen, is orchestration. Not as much as in the enterprise, you still have these data protection teams where they don't care that you've moved the app into a container and it's not supposed to be backed up anymore, right? What's the backup policy, right? And what but it replicates itself across different clouds. But what's the backup policy, right? They're going to continue, because on the paper, on their policy, it says we have to back this up and retain it for 60 days and then move it. So that is another reason I think is there's not a whole bunch of really good solutions for that yet for those traditional apps. So also trying to convince the backup team that some of these refactored apps don't need to be, backed up to tape every night.
And it's not just backing up the data, John, right? I mean, when you're dealing with Kubernetes, it's all declarative. So all of these applications have some manifest files associated with them. And unless you've got those manifest files with the data, it becomes very difficult to put them back together afterwards. So there's more things to think about from backup recovery perspective when it comes to Kubernetes than maybe you would have to consider in traditional applications running on traditional infrastructure.
And if you have a security team that insists on having an IP address statically assigned to every single application, and you have containers that, you know, grab from a pool, and you have a 6-week waiting period to get a new hole poked in the firewall. Not that that has ever happened to any of us.
Yeah, it sounds like you're speaking from experience there.
Just last week.
Yeah, I wonder if, you know, maybe, you know, to the premise of, you know, orchestration is what's lacking. Maybe it's not orchestration. Maybe it's applications. Maybe it's demand. I mean, I really feel like there's a natural tendency for some applications to be containerized and others not to be, and that orchestration is a prerequisite for adopting those applications, but it's not necessarily the hurdle. It's not necessarily the barred door. I think that it may be just a case of enterprises are, you know, they need that, but then they're going to be bringing in containerized applications as it makes sense. Is that off base?
I would agree with you, and I think it's even more complicated than that, insofar as we're now seeing applications that are a combination of containers and virtual machines. And so now you're stuck with, well, orchestration comes back into it again, but can you orchestrate virtual machines as well as orchestrate containers for this application? And so that's one of the things we're looking at as well with our with vSphere, with Kubernetes that came out with vSphere 7.0, is a way of orchestrating applications or workloads and not just focusing either on containers or on virtual machines, but doing a combination of the two if necessary.
Well, not to throw it in there, but there's another thing that's important as well, and that's the storage. You know, I mean, you know, no enterprise application is a container. Enterprise applications are, you know, containers plus storage, really, unless maybe that's my biases showing.
Well, I mean, I would agree with that. I think I did pretty good without talking about, you know, storage for almost 15 minutes. So that's like a record for me. But yeah, definitely. I mean, I see a lot of customers, because they don't understand how to automate the storage, they are looking at it. And it's not like they've discounted containers because I don't know how to do persistent storage, but they're at least coming and asking the question, right? And so I think that's what's keeping me busy, like from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. because, you know, I cover the East Coast to the West Coast, so there's no stopping in the day for me. But it is definitely something where people are trying to figure that out. They're asking the question, and, you know, obviously we provide a way. That's what I talk about all day long. But, you know, it's something that a lot of customers, enterprises, are dealing with right now.
It's interesting because I'm still having conversations to this day where people think that containers is still just stateless information, and that you still need to have a stateful, persistent backend that is not container related at all. And you know, I have to, you know, then go through the talk about PVs and PVCs and storage classes and explain how all of that, you know, breaks down and how you really can containerize your whole stack now. But there's definitely a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt still baked into the layers that you kind of have to churn through. So some people just throw out orchestration along with containers just because that's what they heard in 2018, and that's what they think is still the case.
Actually, Datadog did an excellent survey. They went through the top 10 containerized applications.
Yeah.
Now, it's a little bit dated. I think it's from 2018, but even back then, 7 out of the top 10 containerized apps required persistent storage. So yeah, it's definitely a myth.
Oh, it absolutely is. Yeah.
I mean, I would go so far as to say that storage is the persistence of containers. Am I off base there?
John?
No.
I think you have it, right? Because the container should be able to crash, move, change IPs. The storage stays the same, right? I mean, there's manifests and there's stuff that's in etcd that kind of tracks what, you know, parameters are. That needs to be talked about too. But for the for a database, MySQL database is a very common use case. Is it can die, it can get restarted somewhere else. The data has to follow it, right? And, you know, that's what we do. But, you know, answering that question is something that a lot of people are still looking at, even though, yes, I've been doing this for 2.5 years now, talking about it.
So given that it feels like containers, microservices is being driven by the developer because it has advantages for them, does this panel feel like storage is kind of the lagging indicator because they're uncertain about, a non-persistent environment to them is anathema?
So there is a project called the CSI project, a container storage interface, and that's essentially a I guess it's a across the board, common agreed API mechanism for servicing storage within Kubernetes. And I think anybody who's involved in the Kubernetes space, no matter what company you're working for, there will be some CSI initiative in that company. Um, so there is this specification that, it's been driven by the community. Everybody is adhering to it. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that, storage is the laggard here. In some ways, I think it's very much to the forefront of what's happening in the Kubernetes space. And I know that, John and the guys at Pure have their CSI driver. We have one at VMware as well. And, we're continuing to work towards that's API specification.
I guess I should clarify, I didn't necessarily mean storage technology, but actual storage administrators, the ones who are going to be called to the carpet if data is lost. Are they the ones who are like, I'm kind of uncomfortable with this whole ephemeral infrastructure?
I see them not embracing it. So I'm not, storage admins are people I talk to all day. So I think they're great people. But I think that where you see it is a loss of control, right? So we built an orchestrator, and I don't think there's so much concern like, hey, you're going to lose the data. They know that we're going to protect the data. Our arrays are very highly available. We're not going to lose the data. What they're concerned about is a developer getting as much storage as he wants. And they're very worried about that. So I can explain all the cool stuff we do and how I make it, one line to install, super easy. And they go, well, how do I stop them from using 10 petabytes on your array? Right?
So it's not so much data protection, it's loss of control over resources.
Yeah. And so they want to know where the guardrails are. And Kubernetes is really good. So I tell them every time, Kubernetes has a quota system for memory, CPU, network, and storage. And it works very well. And it will stop if you're concerned the developers are going to, provision 10 petabytes, it'll stop them from doing that. Yes. And it's very easy to implement, and it'll work across all the storage vendors, right? So it's not just Pure, right? It works across everyone.
So when you talk to storage administrators about like storage classes and PVs, do they break out into a cold sweat when they say they can auto provision and oh yeah, you can just ask for it and the claim responds and you're good to go?
Exactly, and as fast as you can go. So we have a customer. This is a funny story. They do 340,000 actions an hour with PSO. So like those API calls, and that's like creates, destroys, but all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
But and they're an outlier. Like they're very, very much like everyone else's average is like 4,000. They're crazy amount higher than everyone else. And when you mention that to an enterprise storage admin, and they break out in sweat, and then they're like, oh my gosh, this is something I can't control, right? Can I put it on its own array, right? Which our salespeople love, because if someone buys 2 arrays, that's better than 1. So, but I'm trying to help them be efficient in what's best for them. So there's ways to get around that and block people from doing it.
Yeah.
It sort of comes back to one of the initial points we made is, the gap between the actual Kubernetes clusters and what are the developers doing at the Kubernetes layer, and how we can track and monitor and manage that at the infrastructure layer. So that's, it's something that we're trying to bridge at VMware. One of the things we do have is a feature called Cloud Native Storage, and that's basically bubbling up how Kubernetes developers are consuming vSphere storage and just displaying that in the vSphere client for a vSphere administrator. So things like what PVs map to which VMDKs, storage classes mapping to data stores, just capacity usage and all that kind of stuff. But I do agree with John. I think what breaks them out in a cold sweat, or vSphere administrators anyway, is how do we put guardrails around preventing developers going nuts on the storage. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say the second follow-up question after that is, how do I log it? How do I monitor it? How do I watch everything that's happening into it? How do I know what the developers are doing? You know, how do I keep the governance and make sure that my, you know, all of the guardrails, governance, and monitoring are all taken care of?
It's like, you know, people look at, you know, Kubernetes and containerized infrastructure and as a service, and they see it as basically an all-you-can-eat buffet, and that just gives everybody a cold sweat, especially if you're the, you know, the chef who has to keep all those items on the buffet. You know, I think that, you know, that's sort of a perennial challenge, and it's always been a challenge for storage admins, especially because there's always just been this insatiable appetite for storage. You know, people chewing up more and more and more. And to go to a storage admin and say, yeah, this will let people, you know, eat all they want. That's a pretty threatening statement right there. So in the end, though, I think that we need to kind of get back to it and think about the core premise here. So, you know, the challenge here that we laid out at the beginning, and the premise that we laid out at the beginning, was that orchestration was why enterprises weren't adopting containers, and why they haven't adopted containers, and what they're looking at in order to adopt containers. And now I'd like to go around the horn here and see, what do you think? Is this right or is this wrong? Is this premise proven or is it disproven? And you know, I'll start with John, and we'll go backwards from the way we started. So what do you think? Is orchestration the reason people haven't adopted containers?
I really don't think so. I think that there are a lot of orchestration options out there that can make their life easier from what VMware does. You know, from the storage side, selfishly, right, is, you know, CSI being able to enable, you know, Pure and VMware to work together on those things. That's I mean, all that's there. I mean, I'm going to stay with that. Getting the technology in people's hands is what's preventing it right now. Like getting the experience to be comfortable doing that for their enterprise applications, I think, is what is the stopper at this point in time.
My perspective is that it's not orchestration per se, it's overall complexity, and orchestration is a considerable part of that complexity when you start to dig into Kubernetes and then all the other things around it, like we mentioned, service meshes and security and storage. That may be what's holding people back. I think the fact that folks like VMware, which have strong ties to the infrastructure community, coming along and saying, we've got this project, we've got this product, Tanzu, that's going to let you operate containers now in the same way that you've done VMs, should help drive the market forward, meaning that it's not just this crazy open source thing that your developers are going on about. When you bring it to infrastructure folks in a nice package and tell them, yes, you can have the controls and guardrails, that'll help. Still, though, it's incredibly complex, and I think it's the complexity that's keeping people away at this point.
Yeah, certainly there is a lot of complexity. It's taken me quite some time to just get what I believe is a basic familiarity with Kubernetes. On the orchestration front, I agree that in the past it was complicated to stand things up, just like I mentioned in the introduction. But there are a number of projects. I think it's been identified and recognized by the Kubernetes community that it is complicated to just get stood up. And I think things like the cluster API, which we're leveraging quite considerably in Tanzu, they're going to help for sure. I would say that there is still quite a bit of complexity, but I think we will see it get easier going forward.
I think that the complexity of orchestration is one of the breaks that's causing people to not fully adopt it. If you are a brand new company today and you have a greenfield environment, then you are 100% going to use containers. And when the application gets big enough, you're going to start orchestrating it. If you are a large organization that has mainframes and 10-year-old applications, you're gonna walk into it a little bit slower. You're going to step more gently, especially if you're taking care of financial data. So the orchestration layer isn't inhibiting people from getting into containers, but it definitely, the added layers of complexity definitely will cause people to pause.
Yep. And I would say that I think the premise is disproven. I feel like orchestration is not the roadblock, mainly because so many companies are working so quickly to integrate and to create containerized, Kubernetized interfaces. My first thought when I saw the announcement, for example, of Tanzu at VMworld was, not, oh my gosh, how interesting this is from a technical perspective. It was just simply, yes, thank you.
Finally.
Things need this. Let's move forward now. You know what I mean? I felt like that was really a necessary step. And for that reason, I do feel that container adoption is going to be much more rapid. And now that there's more support among storage providers, among VMware and applications and so on. I really feel like the enterprise adoption is simply waiting on the applications. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for this podcast. It's been a lot of fun. It's nice to see you all. And to the audience, thank you for listening to the On-Premise IT Roundtable. If you enjoyed this discussion, remember to subscribe, rate, and review the show in iTunes, since that really helps our visibility. And please share this show with your friends. This podcast was brought to you by GestaltIT.com, your home for IT coverage across the enterprise. For show notes and more, go to GestaltIT.com/podcast. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.